Good afternoon, I'm Suzanne Black from the Blair County Conservation District, and today I'm going to teach you guys a little bit about your watershed and the types of pollution that can get into our watershed and some things that we could do to prevent that. So I'm going to have to turn the camera around here and I will show you my Enviroscape. This is an Enviroscape. It is a plastic representation of the area in which you live. So over here we have your school building. And then we have a farm. Oh, that little cow's taking a nap. And then we have a road. Nobody is supposed to be on the roads right now. Your neighborhood, where you live. Construction, that'll be our pipeline construction here. And down here we have what we're calling the Chesapeake Bay. Since we live in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, that basically means that when it rains, all of our water runoff ends up going into, probably if you live in a town, it'll go into a storm drain. Those storm drains, and these would be our storm drains right here, those storm drains will lead to a river somewhere, and all of those rivers lead to a specific body of water. So your watershed is where all the rainfall ends up going into a particular river, lake, bay, or other body of water in that area. So our Chesapeake Bay watershed actually is comprised of 6 different states, pieces of 6 different states. And so anytime it rains and all the water runoff ends up into the streams, eventually it's going to end down here in the Chesapeake Bay, which leads to the Atlantic Ocean. So we're going to look at different sources of pollution that can happen around our home. All right, so if we look at our school in the wintertime, when it snows, what do they have to do to keep you from slipping and falling in the parking lot? They have to add some salt. All right. So in the summertime, what do they do to keep little critters off the grass around your school? They put down pesticides, and they usually send a letter to families letting them know that they've done that. Some pesticides down. All right, so over here we have a construction site. This is the pipeline construction. You notice how they've dug up a lot of the greenery in this area. And that's a really big problem, because what happens when there's soil exposed, when it rains, that rain's gonna actually pick up that soil and wash it into the stream. And sediment is actually a really bad pollutant. So we're gonna have some soil as a source of pollution. We may even have a little bit of oil if any of these machinery is gonna leak. And then we're gonna move over here to our home. All right, so raise your hand if you have a dog at home. I know I have 4 dogs. You probably hear them walking around in the background. Well, our next source of pollution would be dog doo. That was easy for me to get in my backyard. So I'm gonna stick my hand in here and grab a sprinkle. Ooh, yuck. Sprinkle some dog doo. That's a big source of pollution around our homes. Let me sniff my fingers. Oh, actually no, that's hot cocoa mix, so don't worry. All right, so how many of you have families that want to keep your grass really, really green? What do you put on your grass? Fertilizer. We're gonna sprinkle some fertilizer on there. Look at that. Some of you, like my husband, doesn't like insects, so sometimes he tries to sneak some pesticides to get rid of insects around our home, on the outside of our home. All right. And then occasionally we have some trash. Let me grab my trash. They can end up in our neighborhoods and around the streets. All right, over here we have a road. What types of pollution are along the road? Well, in the wintertime, salt. They have to salt the roads, which is really bad, especially for our freshwater fish. And then sometimes we have vehicles that are really old and clunky, and they leak some oil and gas. Some people throw their trash out the window, and it can get into our streams. The number one most polluted item is cigarette butts, believe it or not. A lot of people think that they will decompose, and they actually do not. So cigarette butts should not be thrown outside on the ground. And then over here we go to agriculture. All right, agriculture is actually the number one industry in Blair County, where we live in Pennsylvania. And unfortunately, it can also be a major polluter. But farmers will actually work with people at my office, and we can reduce the amount of pollution that comes from farms. So what are these sources of pollution? So we have a field that has been plowed. All right, so we plowed the field, and then that exposes some soil. Source of pollution. Then we have that tractor. Occasionally our tractors can leak some oil, and then we'll have to get them fixed so they don't do that anymore. What else do they put on fields? Sometimes they need to add some fertilizer. They don't always have to use as much fertilizer with crop rotation, but there's fertilizer. We want to produce a lot of food, and we don't want insects killing it all, eating it. So you have to have some pesticides, unless it's organic farming. And then we have cows. See our friends? Aren't they adorable? But we take their manure and we will sprinkle it and spread it on the fields as another type of fertilizer. All right, so cow manure. Our office works with farmers to even tell them how and work with them on what we call manure management, how much manure they can put on their fields for the size of their fields, and better ways to store their manure so it doesn't end up into our streams. All right, so farmers are fantastic, and they really work to help prevent pollution in our water now. And we definitely need them, especially right now, for our food. So make sure you're buying your milk and your eggs and eating everything to stay healthy while we're all stuck inside. All right, so we have all these different sources of pollution on our enviroscape, and then it's going to rain. Okay, so we're getting a thunderstorm, and it is raining. And when it rains, all those different sources of pollution are picked up and washed into a storm drain or just washed directly into a stream. It's raining here. Now you notice there's a circular area here. Do you see that right there? That actually acts like what we call a rain garden. All right, so a rain garden is an indentation in the ground and has special soil and sand and plants in it, plants that are water loving. And it actually can collect that stormwater runoff, and all that pollution will filter to the bottom, and the cleaner water will then filter through the ground, because we don't want all of our stormwater runoff to go into the streams. We actually want it to go into our groundwater system, because when it goes through the ground, it will actually have all that pollution filtered out of it through the ground. The plant roots, the rocks will filter it out. Let's make it rain on our dog do. Clean up all this mess. And you notice where it's going. My storm drains are blocked with a lot of leaves. Oh no, that can cause some flooding too. And things like rain gardens will actually help prevent flooding. So if you have a really wet area of your yard, you might want to think about making a rain garden there. All right, and then we'll go over here to our farm. Look at that. Oh, sorry, cow. I'm gonna push them into the Chesapeake Bay down here. Now, you noticed when we were up here, the stream didn't, and the rivers didn't look too bad, did they? All right, they didn't look too dirty, a little bit dirty, not too bad. But unfortunately, by the time all that stormwater runoff ends up down here in the Chesapeake Bay, this is what it looks like. And that ends up killing everything that's alive in the Chesapeake Bay, because you wouldn't be able to live in that either, would you? We're going to begin talking about our watershed and water pollution with meeting our friend Fred. This is our friend Fred the fish. I'm going to say hi, Fred the fish. Say hey, Fred the fish. So Fred has a little story to tell. Here's Fred the fish. Fred lives in Altoona, in an area near the Penn State Altoona campus and the Little Juniata River. Fred has lived in Altoona all of his life. Fred's neighborhood is usually clean. Look at that, with sparkling fresh water. How do you think Fred feels? I think he's feeling pretty good in there, isn't he? Nice and clean water. One day, Fred decides to go on an adventure by exploring life downstream. Fred starts swimming towards the Chesapeake Bay. First, he swims into farm country. It begins to rain and some soil rose from the plowed fields and washes into the river. I take some soil. Some that washed into the river. How do you think Fred feels? He's probably thinking, oh, that's a little gross. Fred passes a suburban housing development. Many people like their lawns to look green and healthy, but sometimes people use too much fertilizer. When this happens, that extra fertilizer washes into nearby streams or rivers. A while back, some fertilizer from the lawns washed into the river, and that fertilizer made the river's plants grow very, very fast and thick. Eventually, those plants die, especially in the fall when it starts getting cold in the winter. And when they die, they decay and decompose. And that uses up oxygen in the water that Fred needs to breathe. How do you think Fred feels now? I'll put some fertilizer in here. But Fred's going to keep going. Fred swims under a highway bridge. Some of the cars traveling across the bridge are leaking oil, and it's getting into the river below. Oh no. Ooh. How do you think Fred's feeling now? Probably not so good. He's looking a little sick, isn't he? But Fred keeps going. It's nearing winter and suddenly it turns very cold. There's snow and ice on the roads beside the river as Fred swims by. Trucks spread that salt on the roads to prevent accidents, but when it rains, that salt slush is washed into the river. Oh no. Oh no. Do you think a lot of salt in the water is healthy for freshwater fish like Fred? No, it's not. How do you think Fred feels now? Look at Fred. He's going to keep going. As Fred gets closer to the Chesapeake Bay, there are many towns and cities located along the river. Fred's once passed a city park. People who use the park often forget to throw their trash away in the proper containers. The wind blows some of that trash into the river. Oh, look at that. Trash in the river. How do you think Fred feels now? Let me see your angry faces. He's getting pretty angry, isn't he? Should not be littering in the water or anywhere else either. Fred keeps swimming. Many factories are located in the towns and cities. Although laws limit the amount of pollution that factories can dump into a river, sometimes factory owners make mistakes and accidents happen. Oh no. Put some soapy water in here. Do you think hot soapy water is good for a fish like Fred? No. How do you think Fred feels now? Poor Fred's looking really sad. Fred keeps going. The city's wastewater or sewage treatment plant is also located near the river. Like factories, treatment plants have rules they must follow to limit the amount of pollution that's going into the river. But sometimes accidents happen. Ooh, look at that. It's yellow food dye for the sewage treatment plant. How do you think Fred feels now? Not too good. Poor Fred. He's looking really, really sad. He's crying. But he's gonna have to keep going. Oh no! Finally, Fred swims past an abandoned or closed hazardous waste dump located along the riverbank. Several rusty barrels filled with toxic or poisonous chemicals are leaking, and rain begins to wash these poisons. Look at that. Into the river. Poor Fred. There's the poisons in the river. Poor Fred. How do you think Fred feels now? Poor Fred has died. So next we're going to look at the Enviroscape, and you will see the different types of pollution that can come from your city, your town, or the county that you live in. We're going to look at Blair County in Pennsylvania, and you can find out the different types of pollution and how they end up in our streams. All right, so next we'll be talking about some things that we can actually do around our own homes, like the rain garden, that can prevent this from happening. All right, so we've talked about the different sources of pollution and how they end up in our streams and down in the Chesapeake Bay. And now we're going to talk about some things that you can actually do around your own home to prevent stormwater runoff from entering and the sources of pollution from entering our streams. So this is called Rain to Drain, Slow the Flow. You can actually find this through Penn State Extension. Really cool. Rain to Drain, Slow the Flow. And you can even just Google it, it'll show up. So this is a representation of our neighborhood. All right, so here's land, and then this represents our stream, our local stream. And then I actually have a cup colored blue to represent our stream. So in a natural system, if you make it rain, okay, so I'm going to count and make it rain equally on every section of this cupcake tin. So we're going to start with 8 ounces of water, and this is a natural environment. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. All right, so when it rains on a natural environment, most of that water should go into the ground where we want it to. It will soak into the ground, into our groundwater table. So now what we're going to do is find out how many ounces went into the ground and how many ounces end up in our stream. So I'll add all these groundwater cups together and put them back into the measuring cup. All right, look at that. It looks like we have exactly 6 ounces. All right, remember when you're measuring things that you get eye level with it. All right, so there's 6 ounces of water in the groundwater cup. Pour it back in here for now. And one ounce in our stream. So we had a lot more go into the ground than we did our stream. Now that only adds up to 7. We start with 8, but occasionally, if you look, some of this is going to be lost. It didn't actually go through the holes in our cupcake tins. So I'll add all this back into my measuring cup and set it back up. And then we're going to look at a developed community next. So that was a natural community. Next, we'll do a developed community. Okay, so I filled up my measuring cup back to 8 ounces. And then in a developed community, we still have our stream over here, but we have roads. We have all these solid surfaces. So we have a road, I'm gonna put here. We have a parking lot, a lot of parking lots. Say this is a basketball court. So I wanna know what this is? The roof of a house. And a sidewalk. All right, so we're gonna find out what happens when it rains on a developed community. Now this one might get a little messier just because it's going to, do you think it's gonna go through all these? Probably not, because they are solid surfaces. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Two, three, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. All right, so I have to get some of this to make sure it's going where it should be, not off of the tray. That's where, when kids do this together, they can have teamwork. But I don't have any help or extra hands today. All right, so I'm going to take my solid surfaces off. And we're going to look at our cups again. All right, so a little bit got into the ground because of, I didn't have any help, but we'll measure it. It's like we have 2 ounces. Let's see how much went into our stream. Okay, so in a perfect experiment, all 8 ounces would go into the stream, but we have almost 5 ounces that went into the stream. So the problem is when you have all these solid surfaces, water is going to actually just run off of them directly into the stream, along with any sources of pollution, okay? So, and it also causes a lot more water in our streams, which causes a lot of flooding. I know the past 2 years we've had a lot of flooding, especially in Blair County, because we've had so much rain, and most of it ends up going into our streams, which then flood. People's basements and homes get flooded. And so now we're going to talk about some things that we can do to actually decrease the amount of stormwater runoff into our streams. Okay, so you can see we're starting with 8 ounces of water again. Now, we're going to talk about an improved community, some things that we can do around our house and our neighborhood to actually decrease the amount of stormwater runoff. So one of those things is a green roof, okay? So this is basically, you would have soil and plants on your roof. They're starting to do these a lot in the city. It actually decreases the heating and cooling bills, and it provides a lot of greenery, helps out with producing a lot of oxygen, and also cuts back on the amount of stormwater runoff because those plants in the soil are going to absorb that water. All right, so we have a green roof. Next, we have porous concrete. Now, porous concrete is probably not an option in Pennsylvania because in the wintertime it gets hot, then it gets really, really cold and freezes, then hot again. And if you've ever driven around, you know there are a lot of potholes in the road because of that freezing and warming condition. And so anytime there's a crack in our roads, water seeps down in there. When it freezes, water expands, and then it will actually cause a bigger crack in the road, and then we end up with potholes. So if we have porous concrete, if all that water didn't drain out in the wintertime because the ground's frozen underneath, it would actually crack up that concrete and break it. But this would be perfect for our southern states, and they actually are starting to use this already. And you basically just you can dump the water on it and it'll just go right through it. So we have porous concrete. Something as simple as having rocks for your driveway instead of cement. And then we have 2 options in our parking lot and by our basketball court. These are rain gardens. And these are the rain gardens that you saw in our Enviroscape. And it's basically an indented area, and they're really good in parking lots because right in the middle of the parking lot you can have it slanted so that all the stormwater runoff goes into them, and then all that pollution will get filtered out through the ground. So they're an indented area, and if you go to Nature Works Park, we have a lot of rain gardens there that you can actually check out. All right, so now we're going to make it rain. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Okay, so if you remember, in our natural area, most of that stormwater runoff went into our ground cups, our groundwater cups, right? So in this, then in our developed area, unfortunately, most of that stormwater runoff went into our stream. So we're going to find out when we make some changes to our improved community. Try and get some of that through there. How much stormwater runoff ends in our stream and how much ends up in the ground. So let me add together all of these groundwater cups. Okay, wow, look at that. That is 6 ounces. That is exactly the same amount of water that ended up in our groundwater cups in the natural environment as it did with our improved community. So we can make a huge difference in the amount of stormwater runoff that ends up in our streams just by making some of these improvements. So now let's check out. I did have some water fall off, but we'll see how much went into our streams. Not much. About 1 ounce of water went into our streams, which is exactly like our natural system. And we want the water to go into the ground. So some of us, like me, I have a well. So my drinking water comes from the ground. And also, not only for drinking water, we want it to go through the ground so all those sources of pollution get filtered out and don't end up in our streams, mucking up the Chesapeake Bay or whatever your watershed is. All right, so I hope you learned a lot about watersheds. Now I want you to get on your computer and look up your local watershed and learn about it. All right, so if you live in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, just look at the Chesapeake Bay. They have a website you can go to, and you can learn a lot more about the Chesapeake Bay and about your local watershed. All right, goodbye.